Good morning, everybody. Well, that was quick. I've never seen this group get quiet that quick before. Ryan's back there doing something. I don't know what he's doing. Anyway, let's get out to some great songbooks and turn to number 450. 450. We'll sing this song before we have David lead us in prayer, and we're dismissed to our classes. 450. Give me the Bible, star of gladness gleaming, to cheer the wanderer alone in tempest tossed. No storm can hide that radiance peaceful beaming, since Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Give me the Bible when my heart is broken, when sin and grief have filled my soul with fear. Give me the precious words by Jesus spoken. Hold up faith's lamp to show my Savior near. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Give me the Bible, lamp of life immortal, hold up that splendor by the open grave. Show me the light from heaven's shining portal, show me the glory gilding Jordan's wave. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day.
Let us pray. Mighty Father in heaven, Father, we are thankful, Father, for this day you've given us. Especially thankful, Father, that it's your day and we're here for Bible lesson. We ask that you be with the teachers this morning, that they readily prepare the lessons and teach it according to your word. And we ask that you be with the students this morning, that they gain much from this information, and that we become stronger as Christians in our daily walk for you. Father, please continue to be with the ones that are still traveling here this morning, that their travels here are safe. And again, we are grateful and thankful, Father, for your many blessings. Through Jesus we pray. Amen.
Dismissed to our classes.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Beautiful day, isn't it? Yeah, can't ask for better weather than this in June. 68 degrees, and that's no humidity hardly. So, beautiful day to come and worship together. We're in John chapter 13. If you'd like to turn over there, John 13. It's good to have those, like I said, are here with us in person, also those who are online. Happy to have you with us as well. Been studying the book of John, which everyone knows. It's been with us for the last several years. Anyway, book of John, chapter 13. If I have written down correctly, that we had finished off basically with, I think, verse 26. Or actually, 22, 22. Verse 22 of last week. Again, we're here with Jesus and his disciples as they are observing the Passover feast. Last week of Jesus' life, just a few hours before he's going to go to the cross. And as we've talked in the last couple of weeks, he has given an example of humility, servitude, by washing the disciples' feet. And we're to the point where he's coming to the end of the time together with his disciples, all of the disciples, I should say, all 12. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit this morning. I'm going to back up just a little bit here to verse 18. And this is chapter 13, verse 18. Apologize for a little bit of a frog here this morning. It says, I am not referring to all you. He's talking to his disciples here. This is the time that he is going to expose Judas as the betrayer. He said, I'm not referring to all of you. I know who those who I've chosen, but this is to fulfill all Scripture. He who shares my bread has lifted his heel against me. And this is a quote from Psalms chapter 41, verse 9, where Jesus says this uses this particular scripture. I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen to you, you will believe that I am he. In other words, he is giving them a preview of what's going to happen just in a short time here, that Judas will betray him, and that he knew that it was going to happen. This is not something that came as a surprise. This is not something that was unexpected. Of course, it is to the disciples, as we'll see this as we go on into the lesson. But he says here that he said, I do this so that you will believe that I am he. In other words, this is almost it's not a miracle in the sense of a healing miracle like we've seen him perform, but this is an opportunity for him to say, I'm in control. I'm the one I understand what's going to take place, and I'm telling you this so that you understand, so that you will believe when this happens that I was in control of what was going to take place. And he said, I tell you the truth, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. Again, Jesus is saying here that he is the Son of God, and if anyone accepts Jesus, because he is the Son of God, he is deity, then they're accepting God. In other words, it goes down the line. From accepting Christ, we accept God. And the same thing applies to what he was saying to his disciples there. Because, there was a lot of rejection throughout this whole study that we've talked about, how that there would be Jews who would accept, even Jewish leaders who would accept Jesus as the Son of God. The claims that he had made, the miracles that he had performed, substantiated what he said about himself. But then there would be also others who would deny it. They would see the very same miracles, they would hear the very same words, they would know the very same prophecies that had been fulfilled, but yet they would deny this. And so he just reaffirming the fact that if you accept me, if you accept my words, you're not only accepting me, but you're accepting the Father. In other words, they were joined one to another. And he said after he said this, he was troubled in spirit, and he testified. And he says, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. Okay, we talked a little bit last week about being troubled in spirit. Jesus was also troubled in spirit on numerous occasions, but we have recorded in John chapter 11, verse 33, where he had come to Bethany because his friend Lazarus had died. And it talks about when Jesus approached the tomb before calling Lazarus out that he was troubled in spirit. So Jesus is not one who cannot be touched with the things that happen to each and every one of us on a daily basis. He has those same emotions, those same feelings. He understands when we have troubles and trials in our lives, and he can be compassionate in that way and understand what we're going through. And we read that, I think, last week in I believe it's Hebrews chapter 11. But anyway, so he says, one of you is going to betray me. And beginning then in verse 22, his disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. In other words, they had gathered together to observe this wonderful feast, this Passover, something that they did on a regular basis as Jews. And it was a solemn feast, but yet it was a joyous feast because they had been delivered from the bondage of Egypt. And he had gathered them together there, and I can imagine, that there was joy there, there was happiness there. They were remembering the salvation that they had received because of what God did through Moses. But yet then he comes to the point where he makes the point to them that there is a traitor amongst us. There's someone who is going to betray me. And of course, what would they do? What would you do if you were sitting there and Jesus makes this statement? One of the 12 here, gathered together, one of you is a betrayer, is going to turn me over to the authorities. Because you know that they had gone through this with Jesus. You remember throughout the latter part of our studies that we had been going through that Jesus had been confronted many times that there was plots to kill Jesus. And so this was not something that was a surprise. If we remember back whenever Jesus was going to Bethany, he told them, he said, we're going to go up to Jerusalem. And you remember the apostles, the disciples said, well, wait a minute, Lord, they're trying to kill you. Why do you want to go there? And then, so they knew that Jesus was in harm's way. And they tried to, dissuade him from going to Jerusalem and to Bethany, but he went anyway. And so that they had the idea that there was something going on, that the Jewish leaders were out to get him. And so when he makes this statement, they start looking at one another because they're thinking, I'm sure, to themselves, well, wait a minute. We're not the ones that's going to turn you. We can't be the ones turning you over. The Jews, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, those are the ones who are out to get you. Can't be one of us. And you can imagine the looks around the room as this is taking place. I mean, looking at one another. And he said, one of you is going to betray me. And then as I said, it says, the disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. And in verse 23, one of them, a disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. And Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he meant, or he means. If you understand how the setup was, for this particular feast or any type of a feast like this, we normally, when we set up a banquet or whatever, or a party or whatever, we usually set up tables and we're all sitting next to each other around maybe a table or whatever, setting up. And the custom of this time and this day was basically that they would recline at a table, and the table would be shaped somewhere in either an oval shape or maybe a U shape. This is according to the historians and so on of the time. So they would be reclining and sitting like next to each other with their face or the top of their bodies basically facing this table, and they would be next to each other in a reclining position. So this is where they were. They were in this reclining position, most likely. And so they could see one another, but they were around this U-shaped table. And so they were separated to some degree. Some would be on this side of the table, some would be on the back side of the table, and the others would be on the other side of the table. And of course, the food and all the service and everything would be in the middle there, in the center. So as they were reclining next to him, that you see that reclining next to him, Simon motioned to the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, we know that this is a term that John used, and we associate that term with John. Obviously, he is the author. He's the writer of the book here. But he talks about the disciple whom Jesus loved. And this is not something that is uncommon for him to say. It only happens a couple more times in the scriptures from this point on. But he's referring to himself here, and he says that Simon Peter, motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he means. So, verse 25, leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? So most likely, the way this was, as I said, was set up, is that John was next to Jesus, and that the person on the other side of Jesus, now picture this, the person on the other side of Jesus to his left would have been Judas. Okay, now how do you say, well, how do you know if that's the case? Well, we can look and we'll see some things here that will bear that out. But so you picture John, Jesus, Judas, and then the rest of the disciples around the table. Most likely, Peter is on the other side, the end of the table on the other side, away from it. So he is facing kind of across from John and Judas and Jesus. So he has to motion. So that kind of gives us a hint that he's not there near enough that he could say something to him. So you can kind of see him kind of going maybe this to John, to get his attention. But yet he was close enough that he could say to him, find out who it is. He may have mouthed it, maybe, how sometimes we do that. You can, if you do only use a few words, sometimes you can get the idea of what the person is asking you by just, wording it, without really speaking it out loud. We don't know this. I'm just surmising here, but this is what's taking place here. So the disciples are all kind of wondering. They're looking at one another. Peter says, hey, find out who it is. Which one is it? And so leaning back against Jesus, John asked him, Lord, who is it? Any comments up until this point here? Anybody have any thoughts or ideas or anything they'd like to bring up? All right. So then, verse 26, Jesus answered, it is the one whom I will give a piece of bread. Then he, when he had dipped it in the dish, then giving the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. Now, I had never heard about this before, but this is something as far as a custom is concerned. And maybe you guys, maybe somebody has read this or knows more. But the custom of this dipping the bread into the dish and giving it to a person, the first person it's given to is kind of like a place of honor. Is like someone who is maybe giving a party and they raise their cup in a toast to the individual. Or at a wedding, when the best man gets up and makes a statement about the bride and the groom. This is what historians say and commentators say is what was taking place here. So imagine this, that Jesus has just relayed to them that somebody is a betrayer. He has now relayed this information to John, the Apostle John, that it's the next person the person I dip my bread into the bowl with and give it to is the betrayer. And as I said, you think about that, is that he is, in a way, honoring, not in the sense that we would honor someone that deserves honor, but in a way he is still acknowledging the fact that Judas is still part of them. I mean, by giving this dip, this bread, to Judas. And so that just shows the love that Jesus still had. I think, this is my thought, is that showing this honor to Judas, he still is allowing Judas, because what do you think Judas was thinking? Judas had planned to do this. He had planned to betray Jesus. He had gone to the religious leaders and had made this pact, made this agreement, ahead of time. We read this back, I think, in John chapter 11, I believe it is. That he had made this agreement that, there's going to be a time, and then when a time comes, I will betray, for the 30 pieces of silver that they had promised him. So in his mind, in his heart, he had already conceived this plan. So then when Jesus does this act of love toward him and honor toward him, can you imagine what he might have been thinking at that time? But I think that gave him an opportunity to think over what he had, what he was maybe going to be doing, this plan that he had conceived. I don't know, any thoughts or ideas or anything anybody else would want to bring up? Okay. All right, we'll move on. All right, so then he says that I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Then dipping the bread, or the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. And as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Okay? There's a lot of discussion about the thought that Satan entered into Judas. Some think that there was he had become like a possessed or whatever type of thing. Most agree that it was just the thought that Judas had just planned this. His personality was that of one that would be the type of individual that might do this, that would be a betrayer or a traitor. I mean, we remember that whenever there was mention of Judas taking the money out of the money bag, he was the treasurer. He took care of the money. And he would take money that would have been collected, that would have been given to the poor or to go out and to buy needs that they would have and so on, the disciples themselves. He would take money and he would rob the money back, basically. So his personality and disposition kind of lends itself toward just being that type of an individual, that he would be one who would take advantage of an opportunity to make money or to get money. And so when it says that Satan entered him, let's look at James just for a second, chapter 1. James chapter 1, and I think maybe we can have a little clearer understanding. James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15. Who would like to read that? James 1, 13 through 15. Ange, please.
When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death.
Okay, I think this is an example here. When we talk about sin, this was definitely going to be a sin that Judas was, his whole demeanor, the plot that was against Jesus. But when James is talking about here, when is sin conceived? When we form the thought about doing something wrong, that we know in our conscience that we know is not the right thing to do. But when is there a fulfillment of that sin? When we do it. So I'm thinking here, as I've compared these things here, what James is saying that the desire, we all have the desires to do things we know that are not according to God's will for, our life. But yet we don't sin until we actually make that desire and fulfill that desire, right? And so Judas, again, when we talk about Satan entering him, he had this thought. He was able to think through this, and he knew what the consequences would be. Had he, thought one way or the other, the consequences would be whatever he desired, and then whatever he did and fulfilled that desire. So it says here, that when it's conceived, then it gives birth to sin, and then birth to death, gives birth to death. So again, I think that Jesus is allowing Judas to make his own decisions. If Judas was, let's say that possessed, or Satan entered him into a way that he could not make the choice, would that be right? Would that be something? I mean, is that the free will that we talk about, giving us the choice to be able to decide what we want to do and how we? Would that have been the case? I mean, yeah.
No, it wouldn't. Let's look at Job back in the Old Testament. God and the devil talked, and they talked about, God kind of bragged on Job, and he said, "Oh, you're just protecting the devil. Said, you're just protecting me. You let me take, charge, and you'll see he'll turn." But when he done this, it wasn't that when the devil came to Job, he didn't control Job's action. He just put situations in front of him that would kind of challenged any normal man, what he went through, you know, and, but he didn't actually possess him like what we're talking about here. Because if you possess something, then you're controlling that. And the devil's not ever going to control us. He's going to entice our minds, and our actions is what's going to control us.
Yeah.
Just the same way with God, He's going to tell us, He's going to entice us to follow Him. He's not going to force us to follow Him.
Yeah. We have the free will and the free choice. And now that's not to say that I mean, obviously we know that God knew exactly what was going to take place.
Yeah.
This was God's plan. I mean, but to say that Judas was going to be controlled in that he was pre-condemned or preconditioned by God to make this decision, it would be taking away his freedom of choice and the free will. He had that choice. He could decide whether or not he wanted to complete this transaction, so to speak. And he made that choice. But it wasn't because God made him make the choice or Satan made him make the choice. He laid it out there before him and said, hey, you want 30 pieces of silver? Here's one way to get it. If you're not happy that Jesus is going to be not a king to overthrow the Roman government, that it's going to be a king that's going to be a spiritual kingdom, and that he's preaching peace and love yourself, love your neighbor, and so on. If you're not happy with that, then the only thing you can do then is to, complete this transaction. Kim, you had your hand?
I think Jeannie was first.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeannie, I didn't see you.
Where it talks about we're saved under him, it makes me think of, Jesus had just called him out in front of all the other disciples. And to think of how you feel when you get washed over with embarrassment. And I can just imagine Judas' face turning red and saying to him, think of the anger and resentment that must have been set in motion. I've just been called out, and I've been embarrassed in front of all these people who respect me, and now the one person that loved me the most is the one that did it. And I would imagine Satan entering him would be a sense of jealousy and anger and resentment all in one, and him saying, okay, this is it. I've been caught.
He is bringing it to Judas's attention that Jesus is bringing it to Judas' attention that he knows that he's the one, and that what's going on, what's going to take place. He and Judas have this little situation going on. Remember that the disciples yet are still confused about what's happening. They're not to the point where they understand even what's going on, because it does say that that he went out and they wondered if he were going to give something to the poor. He left and was going to give something to the poor, or maybe he was going to go buy some things that they might need. So I don't know that he had the exact idea, but still the fact is the embarrassment, like you were saying, Jeannie, the embarrassment that he even would have, and then maybe whatever the other emotions would be involved, that he and Jesus were interacting with each other.
Going, how dared him, call me out.
Yeah. I mean, again, we don't know all the details of it, but we can understand through our emotions what might be taking place in the mind of Judas. Yeah, Kip, you were.
I know we just read in James about lust and can lead you to do something. Sin is conceived, but we got to stop and think about what Jesus said about adultery in Matthew chapter 5. He said in 5, he said, I say unto you, whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Okay, so if we let these thoughts, these lusts consume us, just our minds, and that itself is a problem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we need to fill our minds with the Word of God to drive out these. Let's face it, we all have different thoughts, and then we all have different emotions and various things like that. So on a daily basis, we are tempted, to do or to say or whatever. But then again, we have to fulfill that by doing it. And you're right, Kip. I mean, the thoughts themselves, as Jesus mentioned, the thoughts themselves.
It's things that can create a lust in us. If we just keep on that, even though we may not do it, if we think about it all the time, that's just the biggest problem.
Yeah. Dave, and then I'll get you right.
According to Mark chapter 14, prior to the Lord's Supper, Judas had already went to the chief priests. So he had already set this in motion. And it seems that that happened right after he was upset with Jesus. When if you recall, at Bethany, the alabaster jar.
Yes.
And the woman there, he was upset because that expensive perfume was used in a way he thought he could make money. And it seems like right after that is when he went off and went to see if he can make money in another way. It seems like.
Sure.
And then the Lord's Supper was right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're exactly that. I mean, you can see the personality in Judas by the things, as you said, as things he had done. Mark chapter 14, verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So I mean, he was pre-planning this situation in his mind. He had already made up his mind, but he could have not gone through with it. In other words, it wasn't that he was overpowered to the point. I mean, I don't think we can reconcile having Judas not have an opportunity to make the choice to go ahead and fulfill what he had planned. I mean, there may be things we plan that we think we're going to do, and we think, whoa, that's not a good idea. So we don't do it. And so I think the freedom of choice, I think, still has to be given to Judas. But his disposition, his personality, whatever led him, his greed led him to be one that wanted power. He wanted to be, maybe in control, like, in Jesus' kingdom. He wanted the position, the power, the money, whatever, so he was willing to do this. And so, good point there, Dave. Yeah, Ryan?
I think we know that by the devil entering into him, we just know that Judas is saying, he's deciding, yep, I'm going to follow through with this. I'm going to do this. And we know that he wasn't possessed per se or overpowered in mind because of his guilt. He has personal guilt afterwards because of his actions, not because of what somebody else or something else made him do. Yes. He went back to the chief priest and said,
I betrayed innocent blood.
Yeah, I betrayed innocent blood, and they wouldn't take the money because it was blood money.
Yeah.
They wouldn't take it back. But then we also see that he was overpowered and consumed with guilt so badly that it pained him to the point of taking his own life.
Yeah.
So, he was fully aware of his actions and what he had done.
Yeah. He still had a conscience, didn't he? I mean, his conscience could still be his guide, and but it just led him in the wrong direction. But he still had the opportunity, the conscience. Marilyn?
But right after dipping the morsel, he said, "Surely it's not me." So he was still trying to save face even then.
Yeah.
But that was recorded in Matthew.
Yeah, it's yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. Any others? Yes, Lori.
If Judas did in fact have free choice, then this could be a completely different story. And he could have made that decision not to do what he did. And then, okay, but Jesus had to die on the cross. And so I thought about the story of Esther, where, Esther says, I don't think I can do this, what you're asking me to do. I can't remember the other person's name, but he says, God will, if you don't do it, God will find someone else to do it. And so, it's just, we have to remember that God is in control.
Yeah.
Judas did what he did for his own reasons, but history, this what was carried out would still have been carried out even if he had changed his mind. God would just have someone else to.
Sure.
That just came to my mind.
Yeah, it's good. That's a very good point. Very good point. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. So then, Jesus then replies back to Judas here, and he says, "What you are about to do, do quickly." Jesus told him. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to go and buy what he needed for the feast, or to give something to the poor. And as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. So, again, the disciples aren't understanding exactly what's going on from what we read here in John. They're confused. They're thinking, well, maybe, Jesus told him, whatever you're going to do quickly. Go out and buy some food for the feast. Go out and take some money to the poor. Something to that nature. So they're wondering still what's going on. But it does say here, as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out. So he left. So it's leaving now the 11 disciples there with Jesus. So he has gone out. He's left. He's gone to make the arrangements and to betray Jesus. I think it's interesting. It says here that John, for whatever his thought was, but it says, and it was night. I don't know if that's kind of a subtle way of saying that, it's dark. There's something, bad happening. I mean, it just associated the darkness and the night with the fact that it went from, a good thing, a celebration, to something that's just totally on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I don't know, John just says that it is night. I just think it's interesting that the detail that he put into that, for whatever that reason might be. Yeah.
That's a good point, because people sometimes think under the cover of darkness that you can get by with certain things, or certain things won't be exposed. And, in today's world, there's cameras everywhere, so
Yeah.
you are, even though God's camera's on all the time, so.
Yeah. Well, and Jesus used light and darkness a lot. He talked about being the light of the world. And John starts off the book, the very beginning of the book, about Jesus being the light. So I think it's just the contrast of good and evil, joy and sorrow and all this that goes along with that. I think that may just been and then the idea, like you said, Angie, everything's done usually in the dark of night. That's not supposed to be done in some cases, so, yeah, Kim.
This had to be on their mind for a long time. Because if you go back and look at John chapter 6, and he's talking, at that point in verse 67, 66, talks about many of the disciples left and walked away from him. He asked them, he said, the 12, he said, you going to go away too? And Peter responds, he said, well, we believe, though, that you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. But Jesus answered, and this is like a year prior to what we were just reading.
Mm-hmm.
He says, have not I chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil? And so, yeah, that's the way on their mind, is it me? That kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so now you see it coming to fruition.
Yeah. That's an excellent point there, too. All right, any others? Alan?
We talked about where he said, the next one I saw will be the betrayer. And you talked about what you feel like the setting was, that the Lord was sitting here, John was beside him, and Judas on the other side. And Peter asked to find out who it was. Now, Peter, like I said, he either didn't speak up or didn't speak loud enough for Jesus supposedly to hear, so John would ask him. And sometimes when I read this, I wonder how loud Jesus spoke that the next one I dipped salt and bread with will be the betrayer. If everybody could hear him, or was he speaking to John? Because John wrote this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I don't know, I haven't compared it to other accounts, but I don't know if anybody else, but that might have been one of the reasons why everybody didn't put 2 and 2 together when Judas left, that he was the betrayer.
Yeah. I agree. I think that wasn't loud enough for the rest of the group to understand what he was saying. They might have gotten bits and pieces of it, but still, because it says that they thought, well, he's going out to buy something for the poor, or to buy more food for the meal, or whatever. So, yeah.
Just knowing Peter's disposition, if he would have knew 100% Judas was going to be the betrayer, I don't think he'd held back.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have let him betray him.
Yeah. I think you're right. And some of the commentators agree with that too.
Yeah.
They think that if Peter would have heard that Judas was the one, that when he got up to leave, Peter would have stopped him from going.
Mm-hmm.
And, but, I mean, that, we surmise that just by knowing Peter, you know, and what he did at the time whenever they came to arrest Jesus. He was the first one to draw a sword, you know, so, could have been. Yeah, good point though, Alan. Yeah, Kip.
I think we can pretty well tell that they didn't know what it says in verse, we're going to get to that in a little bit here. No man at the table, verse 20, knew what the intent he talked about when he said, whatever you're going to do it quickly.
Yes.
Because if they would have known what that was about, they would have known what he was talking about when he said, do it quickly.
Yeah.
You know, so they probably were curious about this whole thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the case. I think they're not aware of what's going on here. So,
Yeah.
any other comments? Okay, we'll touch on this next few verses here. The first bell has rung, so it'll be short here. But in verse 31, it says, when he is gone, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself, and will glorify him at once. 5 times the word glory or glorified is mentioned here in this short verse. Okay, 5 different times. And it's, I think here when you look at the fact is that that Jesus is saying here that the Son is going to glorify the Father. The Father is going to glorify the Son. And I know the second bell has just rung, but you think about it, how do we glorify our earthly family, our earthly fathers? By what? By doing what? By being obedient to them, by doing the things they ask us to do. And if we put this in the sense of the Father and the Son, I think that Jesus is saying here, I'm obedient to the Father. I'm fulfilling what the Father's wishes are. It's my choice to do so, and I'm doing it because I want to glorify, I want to bring honor to the Father. And then what does the Father do in an earthly sense? Whenever a child does something that pleases them or is obedient, the right thing to do would what? To be honor the child, to acknowledge the child, to say, hey, you've done something good. You know, I like that. And I think it's in an earthly sense, I just kind of, because the Father's Day, I was looking at this, I thought, you know, I've never thought of it that way, but maybe it might be the fact that he is obedient to the Father, and the Father then is glorifying him because of his obedience, acknowledging the fact. Yeah, Kip?
It's those obedient children that you get the inheritance.
Yes.
And it's the same with us.
Yeah, yeah. The obedient children can get the inheritance as an honor to them, and in a spiritual sense, we as obedient children, we have that inheritance to look forward to as well. So, anyways, we'll stop there. I appreciate your very good comments. Thank you for that. We'll begin in verse 33 next week.